we're going to transition right away to our next speaker. And my name is Andrea Schneider. I'm a law professor at Marquette. We're going to be focusing actually on what Gil mentioned wasn't a big deal in Israel, which is BDS and anti-Semitism not hitting here, but it is definitely hitting on college campuses. This is an issue near and dear to anybody who has been on a campus or with children on campuses, as I have. And from my experience at Marquette, I just want to highlight three things that have worked. Marquette is in Milwaukee, for those of you who are not as familiar with Midwest American geography. I wasn't either until I moved there. And it is a Catholic Jesuit institution, so the vast majority of my students are not Jewish. Here are the three things that have worked on our campus. One, and I know Senator Lieberman is going to join and talk to us about this momentarily. The first is to make sure that the Jewish kids on campus are provided with support and education about their own Jewish heritage, about Israel, and ideally provided with that in advance of showing up and fighting BDS, so that they are not caught off guard. The second thing that has worked is to develop cross-cutting alliances with other minority groups and the professors that lead them. Professors are the ones who stay on campus even as kids leave. So it's not just focusing on those students, it's focusing on those who lead those and thinking about whether it's alliances in dealing with refugee issues, other hate attacks. We had the Sikh temple attacked in Milwaukee, and all of the Jewish organizations were rallying around that. That creates religious alliances for when then inevitably there is a BDS attack on our campus. The third one that I'm actually very proud to have worked with for a long time is to make sure that there are non-Jewish kids who can also talk up. I've taken non-Jewish students to Israel every other year for about 15 years. And this is not in particularly linked to BDS. This is part of what I do when I'm teaching conflict resolution. Israel, as we have heard yesterday and today, is a perfect place to focus on conflict resolution. So this is an educational trip. But the fact of the matter is that they were then ready, when there was a BDS proposal at Marquette, to speak up and to talk from a Catholic perspective as to why this was anti-Semitic and therefore anti-Catholic. They were able to talk up as kids that had been to Ramallah and Jerusalem and Haifa and all over Israel of what they themselves experienced when they were dealing with students who had never been to Israel. They themselves were educated. And I believe that it is these three things that allow us to move forward on campuses. I look forward to Senator Lieberman telling us more about that, and his official introduction, which I am delighted to share with you, is that he is now the senior counsel at the law firm of Kasowitz, Benson, Torres, and Friedman in New York. He was for 24 years a member of the U.S. Senate from Connecticut, and at the end of his service in 2013, he was the chairman of the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee, a senior member of the Armed Services Committee. Through both committee positions, he became a leader in protecting the security of the American people and supporting American international leadership. Senator Lieberman is known as a national leader who works across party lines to get things done and who speaks his conscience regardless of the political consequences. Before his election in 1988, Senator Lieberman served for 10 years in the Connecticut State Senate and 6 years as the Connecticut Attorney General. In 2000, he was the Democratic candidate for the Vice President of the United States. Please join me in welcoming Senator Lieberman.
Thank you all very much. Thanks, Professor Schneider, for that really generous introduction. I'm sometimes reminded of an event I went to in Washington many years ago where Henry Kissinger was the main speaker, and the chairman of the event got up and said, if there's anybody in the world who needs no introduction, it's Henry Kissinger, so I give you Henry Kissinger. So Kissinger got up. I wish I could impersonate his still Germanic American accent, but he said something like, well, you know, it's true. I probably don't need an introduction, but I must be honest, I like a good introduction. So that was a very good introduction, and I thank you. It's great to be here at the Begin Heritage Center as part of this 30th Yahrzeit anniversary of Menachem Begin's death, and we are doing really what one should do on the anniversary of anybody's passing, which is to go back to our memories, to think of what that person's life taught us, and to remember ultimately what the rabbis teach us, which is after someone we love or know or revere leaves earth, it's up to us really to, they don't have the capacity anymore to do mitzvot, do good deeds on earth. It's up to us to, in that sense, keep them alive, and also in a more spiritual sense, elevate them in the next world, in Olam Haba. So I think I was here last night, privileged to be part of a program. The speeches were really inspiring and did exactly, I think, what those who put this together, Hertzi Mekov, my dear friend Rob Schwartz, others, they brought Begin into this time. And Gil Troy, it was great to listen to you. Are you Tevi's older or younger brother? Yeah, no, I'll tell him that you were honest about that. Yeah, you were really excellent to remind us of the same, because Begin teaches us so much in his life and leadership that is remarkably relevant to our time, including on the subject that you have asked me to speak about, which is the global rise of anti-Semitism in our time. I mean, to say, I'll come back to Begin's message to us and inspiration to us on this subject, but so much of Begin's greatness is motivated by the reality of anti-Semitism in his time, as seen by Herzl in Paris, who then founded the modern Zionist movement, as seen in Europe by Jabotinsky, who in turn, as we all know, inspired Begin to become involved in the movement, to make Aliyah and become the historic leader of Israel that he was. I want to begin talking about this subject in a personal way and take you back to, with me, to August 7th of 2000. Earlier that day, it had been leaked to the media that Vice President Gore had decided to ask me to be his running mate, run for vice president. They sent a plane to New Haven, Connecticut, where we lived, and to bring my family and me to Nashville, Tennessee, where the announcement would be made that next morning, August 8th. And that evening, the Gore family essentially hosted the Lieberman family. I can't resist telling you that my mother, who was then 85, walked into the room with the vice president, looked up at him, and said, "Mr. Vice President, you made the right choice." You know, Jewish mothers are irrepressible, right? But during that evening, Al Gore said to us that he had decided about 2.5 weeks before that I was his first choice as a running mate. But he thought, because he knew he would be breaking a barrier, I would be the first Jewish American on a major party national ticket, that he should talk to some close friends whose judgment he relied on and who he could trust to keep this confidential. Is America ready for a Jewish person on a national ticket? And he said, to me very honestly, I've worked so hard for this, I didn't want to feel that though I felt you were my first choice, that I was making a choice that would compromise my ability to be elected. And he said, I talked to a group of friends, some were Christian, some were Jewish. And he said, I found something remarkable. Among the Jews I talked to, there was anxiety. And in effect, a couple of them pleaded with me not to select a Jewish running mate. He said, among the Christians, everybody said it would not be a problem. Gore had a better sense of humor that sometimes became clear in the campaign, and he said to me, so having heard these reactions, knowing America is a Christian country, tens of millions more Christians than Jews, I knew I could choose the person I wanted to be my running mate, after all. But then he said something that's relevant to what we're talking about today, which is that he concluded that the fear of anti-Semitism among Jews was much greater than the reality of anti-Semitism among non-Jews in America, including, of course, Christians, which are the majority of the American people. And he took a risk, for which I'll always be grateful to him. Politics, elections are like sports. They've all reduced themselves to numbers. And it is to me a source of pride and really in the American people that on election day, Al Gore and I got 545,000 more votes than the Bush-Cheney ticket. I'm not raising this to relitigate what happened in South Florida. That's for another story. But it really speaks to where America was at that time and vindicated Al Gore's choice. People would say to me in the years afterward, did you face any anti-Semitism in the 2000 campaign? And the reality is I didn't. But I always felt an obligation to say to people, please understand that that doesn't mean that I believe there are no anti-Semites in America. History tells us, of course there are, but the prevailing ethic in our society at that moment disdained bigotry, including anti-Semitism. So, for want of a better metaphor, the anti-Semites stayed under the rocks, and didn't come out. Now I'm going to flash forward to almost 22 years later. It's not such a long period of time in human history, and I fear in America and elsewhere around the world that the reality of anti-Semitism is obviously growing. And it's much more overt. People have come out from under, the haters have come out from under the rocks, and therefore the fear of anti-Semitism is, in that sense, more justified. Why do I say this? Well, you all know it, and I'll just recite some of the facts. I mean, in America, we have had a series of violent attacks against Jews at the synagogues in Pittsburgh and Poway, California, and then more recently in Colleyville, Texas. Increasingly, there are random physical beatings, harassment of Jews in places like New York and elsewhere. A remarkable increase. The ADL came out with a report a while ago, recently really, that said that the distribution of anti-Semitic pamphlets, banners, and other propagandas was up 27% in 2021 from 2020. Now, I want to put that in context. That means that the incidents went from 277 in 2020 to 352 incidents out of a population of 330 million in America. That's a very small percentage of people, and yet it's growing, and growing in other ways as well. There was a really quite remarkable story that I read last week in the Jewish Insider that the American head of Amnesty International, which by now has a reputation for being terribly biased on Israel, a recent report accusing Israel of apartheid, which is really outrageous, but its director, it's actually executive director in America, a man named Paul O'Brien, spoke to a group in Washington and made the claim that the majority of American Jews do not want Israel to be a Jewish state, but rather they want a safe Jewish space based on core Jewish values, whatever that means, whatever the safe Jewish space means. The core Jewish Jewish values, obviously, are what he thinks Jewish values should be. He was asked about polling from the Lieberman Foundation a couple of years ago, which found that 8 in 10 Jewish Americans identify as pro-Israel, and 2/3 feel attached or very attached to Israel. So were these anti-Semitic comments? They're certainly anti-Israel. They're certainly biased, and they reflect the way in which standards have changed for public discourse on Israel and on Jews in general. And I must say, having spent 24 years, proud, privileged to be a member of the U.S. Senate, members of Congress in recent years have said things about Israel that border on the anti-Semitic. They're a minority of members of Congress. But those statements, I never heard in the 24 years anything like them. Is it possible that some of the members I served with in Congress had some anti-Semitic feelings? It is, of course. But they didn't articulate them because they were simply unacceptable. And there are people in Congress today who feel that not only are they acceptable, but they may further their own political careers. So I don't have enough time to go into in depth about the causes of this, and there'll be a lot of others speaking about it. It seems to me that part of what's going on now, why that change from 2000 to today, is a classic result of the time of social and economic upheaval we live in, the remarkable advances in technology that have made so many people insecure about their own economic futures, the changes in social values and what's acceptable, which have threatened the order of a certain number of people's lives. And that all, and this probably is one of the major causes of the rise in anti-Semitism, that all gets magnified dramatically by the internet and by social media. There really essentially was no social media anywhere near what we know today in 2000. The internet was relatively primitive as compared to now. But, I mean, think about it. I did some research after the murders in the synagogues in Pittsburgh and Poway, and the murderers did not belong to any anti-Semitic, neo-Nazi, racist groups as we have traditionally known them, but they were active, almost hypnotized participants in chat rooms that were full of hate and anti-Semitism. They went out and bought guns, and they killed some Jews just because they were Jews. A group that I'm proud to be a member of the advisory board of, which is called Combating Anti-Semitism, CAM, based in the U.S., just a while ago unveiled a study documenting how the taking of hostages at that temple in Colleyville, Texas, by a man named Malik Akram came in the wake of a coordinated social media campaign for a jailed terrorist named Afika Siddiqui. They found, interestingly, that Twitter activity with hashtags like I am Afia suddenly spiked to thousands every week in September of 21, which was pretty much very close to when the attack on that congregation in Texas occurred. And the researchers at CAM were able to trace the burst of coordinated social media activity to a network of Pakistan-based extremist influencers and bots, the pro-Taliban Free Afia Foundation, and also a Texas branch of the Council on American Islamic Relations, CAIR, CAIR. Quite direct. So you can see again the way in which social media will affect certain people who have instability, I guess, and hatred, and all the rest. The other thing that has contributed in our time is a general, and this really goes to Begin too. Begin was a gentleman, you know. He could hurl thunderbolts at his opponents. He had, as Gil said, he had a strong principled premise to his service, but he was very respectful of everyone, including his opponents, and very open to everyone, particularly even if they seemed to be an odd match for him, if they were supportive of the State of Israel. We've, in many ways, our culture has been degraded. It may seem far from our entertainment culture, particularly far from this subject, and yet it has encouraged on the media today, including television and radio, language, a kind of a ferocity of criticism that goes beyond the issues, and has found its way to leaders around the world who are, generally speaking, not anti-Semites or bigots or haters, but have a natural, unfortunately, political tendency to try to exploit the different standards, the lower standards. And that encourages others to act out in ways that are bigoted, hateful, and including anti-Semitism. I don't want to dwell on this, but look, we know from our own Jewish tradition, teachings of the rabbis, the Torah, the Tanakh, the higher position that you are fortunate enough to have in society, the greater responsibility you have to maintain high standards in everything, the way you behave, the way you speak, because everybody else in your kahila, in your city, community, country, will be affected by you because you're a leader. And we could spend a lot of time in another setting on Moshe Rabbeinu, on Shaul, et cetera, the sons of Aaron, the Kohen Gadol. Those are some of the causes. So what do we do in response? And here's why I want to get to the words of Prime Minister Begin. And it builds really nicely, though we didn't coordinate on some of the things Gil Troy said. Begin wrote in his book, The Revolt, "Out of blood and fire and tears and ashes, a new specimen of human being was born, a specimen completely unknown to the world for 1,800 years, the fighting Jew." And I would add parenthetically, that means the Israeli. The Israeli became the symbol of the fighting Jew, not just for non-Jews, but for Jews, and created a confidence and willingness to fight against injustice. Begin continued, "That Jew, who the world considered dead and buried, never to rise again, has arisen, and he will never go down to the sides of the pit and vanish from off the earth." End of quote from Menachem Begin. So that, my friends, is who we are today and who we are called upon to be in the face of rising global anti-Semitism. What can we do to fight? The first thing we need to do, I think, is to not be silent in the face of the subtle forms of hatred, including those toward other people. I mean, it's not just rising anti-Semitism in America. There's been more racism than previously. Asian Americans have been targeted for random violence, and they're picked out because their facial characteristics are obvious. So this is part of a broader picture. We have to begin by speaking out ourselves and saying we're not going to accept this toward Jews or toward anybody else. And we also have to use the credibility, influence, power we have gained with our non-Jewish fellow citizens to ask them to speak out as well, and not to leave any silence in the face of rising anti-Semitism. It's not at enormous numbers today, but it's rising and it's increasingly violent, and we stand back, or in the expression that used to be used, we act in Yiddish, beholten, we're humble, we're going to be quiet, we're not going to make noise, they're not going to see us, they won't bother us. We learned too painfully during the Shoah that that doesn't work. So I would say that's first. The second is to work through government and politics. First, to regulate the internet and social media, which can be done without compromising First Amendment rights. There are limits to the First Amendment. We all know the classic, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. There are many parallels to that here. One of the specifics that's been targeted in the U.S. is something called Section 270 of a law called the Communications Decency Act, which which grants immunity from lawsuits to internet service providers and other social media companies for any content they have on their sites. And that allows the worst, beginning with child pornography, child abuse, and going on to all sorts of forms of hatred, which the government really has to step in and stop. The same is true for us to demand that prosecutors enforce hate crimes laws against people who commit those crimes, that they are in their way as serious as the more traditional forms of crimes. And then I would come back to where Professor Schneider was at the beginning, which is our children. I talked about this a little last night, but just very briefly, part of the Begin story is, as Gil said very eloquently, that he knew Jewish history. And he also grew out of a time when he knew personally anti-Semitism. And of course, he lost family during the Shoah, but he had already committed himself by that time to the Zionist cause. Incidentally, I was fascinated in reading a while ago about Begin. That when he was a law student at the university in Warsaw, not surprisingly, but movingly to me, he organized essentially a Jewish defense league of students to physically respond to the harassment, verbal and physical, that other students were applying to Jews at the school. So I speak for America, or I speak about America, but it seems to me that a lot of our children have lived lives that are so different from Begin's. They've not experienced anti-Semitism, and therefore, when they go to college, for instance, they face BDS, they face anti-Semitism. A lot of them are very active, stand up and fight. They are fighting Jews. But a lot of them just put their head down and want to be quiet. Don't bother me. And really, it's incumbent on the Jewish community and on all of us as parents to educate our children to their responsibility to stand up and fight before this grows again to a point that is disastrous for us. So I end with these words again from Menachem Begin, because in addition to everything else, his eloquence and his vocabulary were so powerful. And again in the book, The Revolt, he has a wonderful turn of words, hate and love. I quote, "Those who fight have to hate something or somebody." Interesting. And we, that is the Uruguay, we fought. But we had to hate first and foremost the horrifying, inexcusable defenselessness of our Jewish people. We had to hate the humiliating disgrace of the homelessness of our people. We had to hate the rule of the foreigner, unjust and unjustifiable. And then, really brilliantly, who will condemn the hatred of evil that springs from the love of what is good and just? Such hatred, this sentence is really important to us every day, but particularly today as we watch tyrants again, including now particularly Russia invading Ukraine. Begin said, such hatred, as he described it, has been, in fact, the driving force of progress in the world's history. Not peace, but the sword in advancement in the cause of mankind's advancement. And he concludes, if you love freedom, you must hate slavery. If you love your people, you cannot but hate the enemies that compass their destruction. If you love your country, you cannot but hate those who seek to annex it. So he leaves us that and he lived this. He lived it to our everlasting benefit. And so I add today, if you love your fellow human beings and their birthright to respect, freedom, and opportunity, you cannot but hate the tyrants, the bigots of all stripes, including, of course, the anti-Semites. That, my friends, is what we in our time must and will stand up and fight. And I have no doubt that we and our values, which are the values and lessons that Menachem Begin left us, will in the end triumph. Thank you very much.